While every single night, Bruno returned to this old bakery, curling up on the cold doorstep as if someone inside was still waiting for him. When the sun rose each morning, he watched every stranger with hope, believing today would finally bring back the person he loved most. Kind neighbors brought him fresh bread and clean water every day, but Bruno never stayed to eat until he looked at the bakery door. Heavy rain, freezing nights, and strong winds couldn't make him leave because his heart refused to believe the story was over. One morning, a young delivery boy stopped his bicycle and quietly asked, "Who has this loyal dog been waiting for all this time?" Jake gently placed a bowl of fresh water beside Bruno, but after taking only a few sips, the loyal dog turned back toward the silent bakery door once again. Curious and confused, Jake asked the elderly neighbor about Bruno, but she only sighed softly and whispered, "He's been doing this for years now." As another evening arrived, Bruno quietly walked back to the exact same spot, lay down on the cold doorstep, and waited with the same unbroken hope. Every sound of approaching footsteps made Bruno jump to his feet with excitement, but every stranger walked away, leaving him heartbroken once again. That night, Jake looked into Bruno's tired eyes and made a silent promise to himself. "Tomorrow, I'll discover who you've been waiting for all these years." Years earlier, this little bakery was filled with laughter every morning, and Bruno never left Thomas's side, following him like a faithful shadow wherever he went. While Thomas baked warm bread for the town, Bruno welcomed every customer with a wagging tail, making the bakery feel more like a family than a business. Before opening the shop each day, Thomas always broke the first loaf of fresh bread into small pieces and shared it with Bruno, calling him his best friend. Every evening, after locking the bakery doors, they walked home together through the quiet streets, enjoying the peaceful sunsets that had become part of their daily lives. But one stormy evening, Thomas suddenly collapsed outside the bakery and Bruno barked desperately for help, refusing to leave his best friend alone even for a second. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived outside the bakery. As paramedics rushed Thomas inside, Bruno ran beside the stretcher, barking desperately, unwilling to let his best friend disappear. The ambulance pulled away into the rainy night, but Bruno refused to stop. He chased it through the empty streets until his exhausted legs could barely carry him. When Bruno finally reached the hospital, the ambulance had already disappeared behind the emergency doors. He waited outside, hoping Thomas would walk back out at any moment. The first night turned into another, then another. Bruno slept beside the hospital entrance, never wandering far, believing his best friend would call his name again. Days slowly became weeks, and weeks became months. Seasons changed around him, but Bruno's faithful heart never stopped believing Thomas would finally come home. Before sunrise, Jake quietly sat beside Bruno, watching him stare at the hospital doors. Deep inside, he knew this wasn't ordinary loyalty. It was unconditional love. Later that afternoon, Jake searched the dusty bakery. Hidden beneath old photographs, he discovered a picture of Thomas standing proudly beside a young Bruno. The faded photograph revealed their beautiful past. Every morning, they opened the bakery together. Every evening, they walked home together, never leaving each other's side. Mrs. Eleanor looked at the old picture and softly whispered, "He isn't guarding this place. He's still waiting for the only family he ever had." Winter arrived with freezing winds and falling snow, but Bruno returned to the same spot every single day, believing Thomas would still walk through those doors. At the hospital reception, Jake finally received Thomas's old medical records. As he slowly read every page, his hands began to shake with emotion and disbelief. Sitting alone outside, Jake wiped away his tears. Thomas had never abandoned Bruno. Fate had simply separated two best friends who loved each other more than anything. Meanwhile, Bruno continued watching the hospital entrance with the same hopeful eyes, believing every opening door could finally bring Thomas back into his life. Jake gently showed Bruno the old bakery photograph. The moment Bruno recognized Thomas's smiling face, his tail slowly began to wag with pure happiness once again. As another cold night covered the hospital in silence, Bruno quietly lay beside the entrance, refusing to lose the hope that had kept him alive for so long. Every morning, Jake returned before sunrise. No matter how cold the weather became, Bruno was always waiting in the exact same place with the same hopeful eyes. Unable to ignore Bruno's heartbreaking loyalty, Jake shared his story online, hoping someone, somewhere, might recognize the man this faithful dog refused to forget. Within hours, Bruno's story spread across the country. Thousands of strangers came to meet him, but Bruno searched every face for only one person. Then, one quiet afternoon, Jake's phone suddenly rang. As he listened, his eyes filled with tears because the impossible had just become possible. Bruno suddenly stood up. His ears lifted and his tail slowly began to wag. Deep inside, he recognized footsteps he had been waiting months to hear. The hospital doors slowly opened. An older, weaker Thomas stepped outside with the help of a cane. Bruno froze in complete disbelief. Unable to believe his eyes, for a single heartbeat, time stood still. Then Bruno sprinted across the sidewalk with all the strength he had left, racing toward the man he loved. Thomas dropped his cane and wrapped both arms around Bruno. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I'm so sorry I made you wait." Doctors, nurses, and strangers stood in silence, many wiping away tears as they witnessed a reunion built on endless love, hope, and unforgettable loyalty. That evening, Thomas and Bruno walked away from the hospital together. For the first time in months, Bruno wasn't waiting anymore. He was finally going home. The very next morning, Thomas unlocked the old bakery once again. As the familiar bell rang above the door, Bruno happily walked inside, finally back where he belonged. The warm smell of fresh bread filled the bakery once more. Customers smiled as Bruno greeted everyone with a wagging tail, just like the old days. This time, Bruno wasn't lying outside, waiting anymore. He rested peacefully inside the bakery, knowing the person he loved would never leave him again. Thomas gently hugged Bruno and whispered, "You never gave up on me, and I promise I'll never leave you again."